Good afternoon. Welcome to the session on tackling disinformation on climate change here at COP28. We are at the RTD pavilion in Brussels for a 1-hour site event. And let me start with thanking the organizers for this opportunity. Here with us, we have 4 speakers from left to right, Kristina Kovačíková, Eileen Coughlan, Jeremy Harry, and Henrik Bruns. My name is Jens Linger. I'm from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. After the 4 presentations, we'll have a short panel discussions. And for the participants online, there's a Slido to collect questions, which we'll get back to at the end. And without further ado, let us start with the first presentation. Dr. Kristina Kovačíková has a PhD in mathematics with a focus on algebraic graph theory. She's part of the disinfo team at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, where she works on machine learning and network analysis. Kristina, the floor is yours.
So, as it was already said, I am part of the disinfo team, and I will try to give you a very brief overview of techniques that we are using to detect most important narratives inside of textual data. And what data would we use for this analysis? We mostly use factual news collected by European Media Monitor. During this presentation, I will refer to them as mainstream media. We also analyze unverified sources, which are defined as sources labeled by official fact checkers and disinfo and misinfo experts as sources very often spreading misinformation or disinformation. The last source of data for us that I will present during this presentation is Twitter. And what techniques we use to analyze such a huge amounts of data? To identify narratives inside of this textual data, we use two types of artificial intelligence method. They can be divided. The first one is called clustering of text, and this is useful to identify text of similar stories, as it is shown in this very simple example on the left-hand side. The second method that we use is text classification. For this, we use the more complicated AI model, which has to be trained on before prepared data. These models are used to detect text which have important properties for us. And now we already see some example of data that we use. The image, the figure shows the distribution of news speaking about climate change. We see the data from two sources, from mainstream media and from unverified sources. The data are aggregated into months, and what is very nice to see is that sources are very nicely reacting on important events and on reports about climate change. But this is not enough what we would like to see. We would like to understand what narratives are behind the peaks that we see in this picture, whether these articles are positive or mostly negative, or whether they are mentioning some important events or important figures. The first method that we use to classify and to discover properties of text that we are collecting is detection of persuasion techniques. To detect these techniques, we use very complex classification model, which is based on neural networks. In the figure, we we can see the complete code book which was used to train of this model. The very the as examples of persuasion techniques, we can see strawman attacks, casting doubts, or appeal to popularity. And what results can we get after applying of this very nice model on our climate change data? We will explain it in the following slides. What analysis we did? We took two time periods of data which are corresponding to COP27 and COP28 event. And from the statistics that we can see in these slides, it is not visible that there are some differences between using of persuasion techniques. We can see that the percentage of the articles which contains any persuasion techniques is almost similar also for mainstream media and also for unverified sources. More interesting result we can see after some more detailed analysis. This figure already show the distribution of persuasion techniques used in articles of unverified sources and of sources from mainstream media. We can see that unverified sources use most often name calling and labeling, or also questioning the reputation and appealing to hypocrisy. On the other hand, mainstream media use very often appeal to authority or appeal to values, which is quite nice to see in the data. Sorry. And this figure shows that the distribution of persuasion techniques in news is also country-specific. Here we can see that, for example, Germany, the sources from Germany are very often using the name calling, and also the questioning the reputation is also specific just for selection of countries which you can see in this slide. Now we would like to show you some even more detailed analysis. We will explore in detail the one persuasion technique which was mostly used by unverified sources. It is called name calling, and this slide is very helpful to better understand the definition. You can see here two examples, two quotes from news that we explored. They are really citation of the news from some source that we were analyzed. In the first example, we can see the quote of some source which is mentioning that the mainstream source Welt told about the Greta Thunberg that she is naive. The second example is much more generic, and they are not. The source is not mentioning some particular person, but the group of people. And here we already see the main stories where the name calling and labeling was used. This result is created by to get this result, we had to, in the first place, cluster all the news into stories, and then we analyzed each story in detail. For this analysis, we used the large language model. In this case, it was GPT, and we asked this model what was the main topic of the cluster which was detected. We can see that for Germany, for the year 2023, the news which are using name calling and labeling are mentioning mostly events that are important for this time period. It is about Greta Thunberg, about Robert Habeck, and other important events in climate for Europe and for Germany. On the other hand, when we analyze the news using name calling for Russian sources, we saw that they are mostly using this technique in connection with other European countries or with European politicians. In similar way, we try to explore questioning the reputation for unverified sources. Again, we check in detail Germany and Russia. And again, we clustered stories using questioning the reputation into news, questioning the reputation into stories. And we try to analyze what key phrases are they using in their articles. For case of Germany, we can see that they are always writing about actual challenges, about climate change, about necessity of protection of climate. And on the other hand, Russian sources are again questioning the reputation of European countries and European activists or politicians. Now, when we already have a technique to cluster news into stories, we would like also to see their behavior in time. For this, we have just preliminary results, which are shown in the slides. We can see the cluster which is speaking about meeting of US and Chinese leaders, and here each dot is representing one article speaking about this meeting. On the x-axis we can see time, and the y-axis represent the y-axis is showing how similar these articles are. From this, we can see that the peak of this story was roughly around 15th and 16th of November, but it stayed interesting also a couple of days after this meeting. In this way, we can compare and analyze also other stories, and we can see that their behavior is completely different. For example, here we have example of 12 stories, and it is interesting to see the green and blue story on the top, which are close together, and they are both speaking about Greta Thunberg. This method is usable also from data from Twitter. We can analyze and clusters also tweets from Twitter, and we can analyze stories which are important during the time. To show this, we picked the Twitter data which are mentioning COP27, and we analyzed the time period of 1 month. And here we can already see results. In the bottom of the slides, we can see the total number of tweets for each week of analyzed period, and which is the blue line, and the orange line shows the size of biggest clusters representing the top story during this week. What is nice to see is that Twitter is reacting on important event, important event or important figures connected with COP28. The obvious outlier is the week around around 1st November, where we can see that the top story is of the size more than 1,000, and it is speaking about importance of vegan diet. We analyzed this cluster deeper, and we found out that it is a group of people which were synchronized because the content were very, very similar, and they were tweeting this content during the same time period. From this, we can see that we are able to analyze content of Twitter as stories, and we are able to analyze also potential impact of these stories, or analyze also organized group of users in Twitter. This was already my last slide, so thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Christina. Without further ado, let's move on to the second presentation by Eileen. Dr. Eileen Coughlin works in disinformation response in the European Commission's Directorate General for Communication as part of the Secretariat of the Commission's Network Against Disinformation. Eileen, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jens. Oh, there we go. So, as Jens said, I work in the Directorate General of Communication. We've just heard a lot of really interesting information about the research that JRC is doing on this, and we work very closely with them. And our aim is obviously to put that into practice in terms of how we respond to communication or to disinformation through communication. Firstly, I suppose we need to ask the question, what is disinformation? There are a lot of different terms out there that are used very regularly. We tend not to use fake news anymore because it's often politically manipulated as a term. It can mean lots of different things to different people. Misinformation we define as false or misleading content that's shared without harmful intent. It can still have a harmful effect, but the person who's sharing it does not necessarily intend that effect. Disinformation is false or misleading content that's spread intentionally to deceive or to secure economic or political gains, and again, it may cause public harm. Finally, foreign information and manipulation and interference, which is what the European External Action Service does an awful lot of work on, is strategic, coordinated and intentional information manipulation from a foreign actor. Obviously, as your average person in the street, it's not always easy to tell what's going on, which one of these is the case in a particular incident. But for us, of course, it's important, especially when we're developing policy responses. Why do we need to fight against disinformation and other forms of information manipulation? In some ways, this is a really, really simple question, and it might be very obvious to some of you, but others will say, well, when we fight against disinformation, we need to be very careful that we're not trying to act as the truth police, and this is very true. Always when we fight against disinformation, the idea is to prevent people being manipulated, because the aim of disinformation is to stop people making free decisions. So we can see that disinformation increases societal polarization. We've seen examples of that very recently in many countries. It reduces trust in democracy and often explicitly discourages people from voting. It reduces trust in expertise, and obviously this is really important when it comes to climate disinformation and climate action, because it creates often this idea that each of us can independently make our own decisions. We can assess the science ourselves, and we can draw our conclusions, when in fact we need institutions, we need expertise, we need scientific consensus to make proper choices and to make good decisions that protect our world. And fundamentally makes it more difficult for individuals to make informed decisions about how to vote, but maybe also about what car to drive, about how they travel, what kind of a house to build, all of these decisions that also reflect on our individual lives, but also on our impact on the climate. And of course, it's threatening to health and to other aspects of life. We saw this very clearly with COVID, but we can also see this in the area of climate. Many people are suffering in terms of health. Air pollution is an obvious one, but also heat waves and various other incidents. What is the EU doing? Well, firstly, we're communicating, and obviously this is the area that I'm working in, so I'll talk a little bit more about things that we've done in this area. We communicate openly on social media and traditional media. This might sound a little bit like a cop-out, like it's a very obvious thing to be doing, but the fact is that if we leave the information space vacant, if we communicate badly, if we don't get our message across, that's when there is space for someone else to come in and manipulate and deceive people. Also, our colleagues in the European External Action Service have an excellent website and social media accounts, EU versus Disinfo, which is about exposing and preventing disinformation. So often getting ahead of a story because they've done the analysis and explaining to people what the real story is and why this particular manipulation is not true and what the intention of the people behind it might be. We also support access to information, and this can be through providing resources on media literacy. For example, DG Com, or the Directorate General of Communication in the Commission, has a toolkit for teachers on how to teach about media literacy and disinformation. We also support independent media, and we support fact checkers while giving them their independence, of course, because it's really important that they can also call us out when we get things wrong. We also cooperate, obviously, because there's no way that any of us, any institution or any individual can have an impact working on their own. We work with EU member states, we work with international organizations and also partner countries to stop the spread of disinformation and information manipulation and to increase media literacy. Finally, we regulate and we legislate. We've created rules for social media companies to minimize the spread of false information on social media and to protect users, because we know that social media is something that has exploded in terms of its importance in the last 5 years even, but certainly 10 years. And we need to have regulation in this area. We also, through sanctions, we have stopped or suspended certain Russian state propaganda media from operating within the EU. And again, this is all about trying to make sure that our information sphere is free so that we can have proper discourse and debate within society. I will talk a little bit about regulating social media and supporting fact checkers. This is actually done by the Commission's Directorate General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, DG Connect. But I think it's a very interesting area, and I'd encourage you all to find out a bit more, because the Commission is really leading the world on this. First, there was the Code of Practice on Disinformation and the Strengthened Code in 2022, which is the world's first voluntary agreement among online platforms to set standards and commitments to fight disinformation. Then this year we've had the Digital Services Act, which makes a lot of these measures mandatory. It has measures on transparency, on access by researchers, because as we've just seen, researchers need access to social media in order to tell us what's going on there. And we need to understand that if we're going to take meaningful action. And also the Digital Services Act has measures against manipulation of platform services. Finally, they fund the European Digital Media Observatory, which was founded in 2020, which is an independent project with fact checkers, media literacy experts and academic researchers. The aim is to understand and to analyse disinformation, to build societal resilience against it. So I work, as Jens said, in the Secretariat of the Network Against Disinformation in the Commission. One of my areas that I work in is monitoring. Now, a lot of the monitoring is done by Jens and his colleagues. So a lot of this, the aggregating, the filtering and the sorting, is done by them, but you also need some level of human input in it, and that's where we come in. We are not mathematicians, we are not experts on computer models, so we rely very heavily on our colleagues there. But it's the key point here is testing and figuring out if something is really disinformation. And we can't always tell for absolutely sure, and I will explain later. We don't aim to explain or to put out there, this is untrue, this is false, this is manipulated. We aim to reach people with positive communication. So we're not, again, acting as the truth police, but some of the ways we can tell that something is disinformation. We can see strategic amplification. For example, if you see articles suddenly coming up in Russian media that July was very cold in Ireland, this is not something that Russian media generally reports on, so there's probably a strategic goal. Distortion and manipulation, telling part of the story, and telling clear falsehoods. It would be nice if we had clear falsehoods most of the time. Unfortunately, it's generally something in between number 1 and number 2. This is a graph. It is not as nice as Christina's graph, but the idea here I just wanted to show is that it's quite messy. We see different narratives coming and going all of the time, and climate narratives also are in competition with many other narratives. So we can see that just the same way as in mainstream media, we can see, last week or maybe 2 months ago, let's say, we saw a lot about Ukraine, and now we see a lot about Israel-Palestine. The same thing happens for disinformation. And we can see that their attention goes from one story to another. But the key thing that we do this monitoring for is to respond. And in our DG, our Directorate General, we work in communication. So this, I'll just talk very briefly about an example of a campaign we did with our colleagues in DG Klima. Jeremy will be able to tell you a little bit more about their side of it. The idea was to respond to climate disinformation, which we already kind of know what the trends were, and to proactively disseminate counter messages, specifically during the summer, which is a time where we have a lot of specific climate stories that come up, and Jeremy will talk more about that. It was taking mostly a pre-bunking approach. So pre-bunking is like the opposite of debunking. So before you've heard the lie, we're going to tell you the truth. So again, it's about positive communication. We're informing people, we're giving them access to the information before they've even come across a distortion. There's also a debunking a dimension. We have colleagues who work in social media, and their job is to respond to comments, many of which can be manipulative, or you know, it may not be intentional. It might be someone who's misinformed and could be very argumentative. So we provided them with lines with scientific input about how they can respond to it. And the aim here, so there's kind of 4 aspects to designing the content of the campaign. Firstly, we're looking at referring to climate science, and also showing things as a shared experience. So it's something that is real, and it's something that experts can tell us more about. And these 2 things sometimes are not treated in the same way. Secondly, we're highlighting that action against climate change is in all of our interest. Thirdly, and this is really important when we talk about climate, is offering a sense of hope and empowerment. There is something that we can do, and therefore we should take action. We do not want people to give up. And finally, of course, we want to raise awareness of the EU's commitment to meeting climate objectives. So these are some of the images, but Jeremy will talk more about them in a minute, so I won't say any more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. Let us move straight to the third presentation. Jeremy Harry joined the European Commission in 2022 as an Information and Communications Officer in the Directorate General for Climate Action. Previously, Jerry worked in communications at BirdLife Europe in Central Asia and at the Council of European Municipalities and Regions. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jens. Now, before diving deep into climate disinformation, I wanted to start by taking a little step back and talking about climate communications as a whole. So, for a large part, climate communications is about raising awareness about the reality of climate change, what causes it, what its consequences are, the natural disasters, the health impacts, business impacts, and so on. And at the European Commission, climate communications is particularly means communicating EU climate action. So in 2019, President Ursula von der Leyen launched the European Green Deal, which is the European Commission's strategy to become, for the EU to become the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. And that is now law with the European Climate Law. So the EU will reach net zero emissions by 2050, and we will also reduce our emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. And to achieve that, we're working on many different fronts on transport, energy, environment, and so on. And within the communications team in which I work, we strive to get the word out on what the Commission's doing and make our policies known and help make sure they're understood. Now, why am I telling you all this? It's because that's what climate disinformation threatens. By that I mean that the consequence of climate disinformation is that it erodes public awareness of the reality of climate change. It lowers public support for climate action, and it harms the credibility and the legitimacy of climate action itself, and puts us more at risk of the horrible consequences of climate change that I showed above, which obviously nobody wants. Now, moving on to my next slide. So, climate disinformation, Eileen defined it earlier, and here are just a few examples just to stress that it can take many different forms. It goes from the very blunt and broad sort of climate change doesn't exist to the more sophisticated, oh, well, climate change is true, but you know, maybe it's not that bad, so let's not do anything. And then you also have one which isn't climate denial per se, but something that unfortunately we are noticing more and more, which you could refer to as climate doomism, in which some people will say that, well, we're all doomed, climate change, it's too late to do anything anyway, so let's just keep using fossil fuels and let's just keep emitting greenhouse gases, because it's just too late to act. So those are the different forms of climate disinformation that we deal with, and so they can take many different forms, and they can also touch upon many different topics. It's not just on climate change itself, but it can be a subset of climate science, or also a subset of EU climate action. Now I'd like to share some good news. So earlier this year, in May and June, we ran a survey, a special Eurobarometer on climate change, where we surveyed over 26,000 people in all EU member states from different demographics, and we found out that 93% of EU citizens believe climate change is a serious problem, and 88% of EU citizens agree that greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. So this clearly shows there's a very large share of Europeans who are aware of the reality of climate change and support EU climate action. Now, why am I saying this? Also because sometimes on social media you might get the impression that everybody's a climate disinformer. No, those voices are certainly very vocal, good at using the algorithms to get on top and get very visible. But when you look at the research, it shows that in fact people do support climate action. So it's important to keep that in mind. And it also shows that one of the consequences of one of the effects of climate disinformation is that it might make you think that, oh well, people don't support climate action, when in fact they do. That's not to say that we shouldn't do anything about climate disinformation. It's still dangerous, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about what we do on that. So Eileen has spoken, given a clear picture of what the Commission does in general, from the communications approach to the policy initiatives, and now I'd just like to talk a little bit about, from a communications perspective, how we deal with climate disinformation. So when confronted with messages such as climate change doesn't exist, it can be very tempting to take a reactive approach and just reply saying, hey, no, that's not true, climate change does exist, look at this X, Y, Z, and so on. But if you take that approach, the problem is you're elevating the voice of the person who spread the disinformation in the first place, and you're also letting them talk about the topic they want to talk about, and while in the meantime wasting precious time and energy that you could have used doing other things. So what we try to do instead is to lead the conversation ourselves with a positive narrative. We stay focused, share the facts, communicate on what matters in terms of EU climate action, share the policy initiatives that are running, and try to get the word out and make sure people understand, and to not let the disinformers set the agenda. And Eileen was talking about the difference between debunking and pre-bunking. So we're very much focused on pre-bunking. So, you know, just to repeat, debunking would be showing why, so somebody's made, say, a false statement, and then you show, well, that isn't true, this is the truth, blah, blah, blah. Pre-bunking is the other way around. So you anticipate that somebody's going to make, some disinformation is going to come, and so you tell, set the facts straight beforehand. Now, something else, which is easier said than done, is to make the facts I've written more convincing, but the facts more convincing and more attractive than the falsehoods in terms of communications. By that I mean, if the climate change doesn't exist is in big bold letters with balloons and ribbons and so on, and this is climate science is real is written in a small font, and you can only find the reality of climate science on the 10th results page of your favorite search engine in a footnote, well then that doesn't work. So it's important to try to just good communications practice and try to keep conveying our messages in a way that works with our audience, try to attract attention in an ever-changing communications landscape. It's a challenge, but it's very important. Now I was talking about what we do, but it's actually everybody's role to tackle climate disinformation, from the EU to the member states, local and regional governments, the media, NGOs, private sector, and so on, and also you as an individual. So you've probably heard the phrase "don't feed the troll." Something like on social media, for instance, if you see someone sharing an obvious bait message where they're saying silly things about the climate, don't react. Just take a breath, deep breath, leave it instead of giving it more attention than it deserves. And then the converse of that is do feed your friends, and by that I mean do help the good information, the climate science get more attention. Like those posts, comment on them, share them, and so on, and also spread the word by yourself on your channels. If you're convinced of the reality of the climate crisis and you're aware of what's being done and what's necessary to act, do share it. Do be part of the solution, and also stay informed yourself proactively, so that you're kept abreast of the latest developments. In terms of EU climate action, you can follow our news on our website, on our social media channels, and on our newsletters. I'd also like to say a quick word on the European Climate Pact. So the European Climate Pact was launched in 2020 as part of the European Green Deal, and it's a citizen engagement platform for climate action. So through the European Climate Pact, citizens can get together and step up their climate action and within their communities, and also share the word about what's going on in terms of EU climate action where they live and where they work. And there are also a bunch of resources that the European Climate Pact has. So now, nearing the end of the year, might be some dinners coming up where you're expecting some heated conversations around the climate. Well, the European Climate Pact has a great resource for you on how to talk to people about climate action, which could be very useful. Now, back to the summer social media campaign, which Eileen was talking about. So that was this summer, talking about pre-bunking. So this was a pilot campaign which we launched. We were anticipating as some disinformation to come up during the summer, as it had in the years before, about the consequences of the climate crisis on the worsening of heat waves, droughts, fires, and so on. So in anticipation of that, we prepared a pre-bunking exercise, sharing the images you can see here and the text you can see on the screen on our social media channels to preempt the disinformation that would come. And in fact, July 2023 was one of the hottest month that was on record. So that proved that it was necessary for us to do. Also, sharing on social media was a consequence of the fact that starting earlier this year, we've seen an increase in climate disinformation on social media. In fact, since Elon Musk took over X, formerly known as Twitter, a number of climate scientists have left the platform because of the atmosphere of hostility that has emerged as a result of letting climate disinformation, I was going to say run free, but in fact enhance it through the algorithm. So I think that's my time. Thank you very much. I'll now pass on to Hendrik. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let us move to the fourth presentation by Hendrik. Dr. Hendrik Bruns is a policy analyst at the EU Policy Lab of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Hendrik works on disinformation and pro-environmental actions from a behavioral science perspective. Hendrik, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jan. Okay, so I will give a presentation now going a bit back to the science again, more specifically the behavioral science, and I will draw on a lot of points that you already made, so some of this might actually be a repetition, but I think that's actually a good thing. So we will now look at a bit more the psychology behind why people might share misinformation, the behavioral science. So we actually, when we do research, we really investigate how people make decisions, why they make certain decisions. So in this case, why they share misinformation, and of course, how we can help our colleagues here who really work to fight misinformation with the best evidence to actually decrease the sharing of misinformation or the belief in misinformation and disinformation. And I'm going to use a little metaphor to approach a bit this subject. So we're thinking about often on misinformation as that there are roots as of a tree, so the psychological reasons why people share misinformation or disinformation, why they believe in it. And then going up through the trunk to the leaves, actually, so the consequences, which I think Alina already talked about, so which can be very severe. They can be very severe in terms of what we have seen in COVID, for example, really health implications of believing in disinformation, up to consequences for support for certain policies, for example, especially for climate change policies. Then what can we actually do to heal, in this case, the trunk, or in order to make a society more resistant, more resilient to climate change, to misinformation and disinformation? That's actually the last pictures on the outer right-hand side. So the goal of creating a society that is resilient against disinformation, so that is protected against disinformation. And in this talk, we are just going to focus on these two aspects for sake of time, and starting with the roots. And we actually know in the psychological literature already a lot, or we can say a certain number of things about why people believe in misinformation from what we know about the psychology on conspiracy theories. That there is evidence that by our psychology, we are looking for patterns. So people look for patterns in certain things they are observing. This has reasons of how people arrive at the truth. And this looking for patterns is one hallmark of what can lead people to believe in conspiracy theories. Another aspect is that we are very sensitive to power relations. So there's actually a good amount of evidence showing that people who are lower in the power hierarchy are more receptive to conspiracy theories, and that that believing in conspiracy theories can be a means to reestablish that power or to challenge the negative power gradient that is existing. And a third aspect, our sensibility to uncertain environment, that has to do with how humans the evolution of humans, that we are very sensitive to factors that can actually impact our existence. So if we feel threatened, we are very sensitive to these. We are monitoring these uncertain environments. And all of these three factors have been shown that if certain conditions are met, people or groups or societies can be more receptive to conspiracy theories. And this also is to some extent also reflected in the reasons why people believe or share misinformation. So we in the past, in the last year, we had a project where we actually looked more deeper into characteristics of groups or people that believe or do not believe or share or not share misinformation on COVID. But we think that a lot of these insights that we have there are also applying, or we know in fact that they are also applying to sharing or believing misinformation more general, so including climate change. So we look at belief in misinformation and sharing of misinformation, because these can have different reasons. We don't necessarily have to believe in something in order to share it with others. There are different reasons for sharing. And this is just really to basically a means to characterize certain groups of people to see if they are very, very vulnerable to believing in misinformation or sharing misinformation. That doesn't, so looking at, for example, the socio-demographic factors, so if, for example, people with a certain age or with a certain income background or with an educational background are more or less likely to believe or share misinformation. This doesn't really tell us why it is the case, but it allows us to identify certain groups that are maybe especially in need of being supported, of being communicated through or debunking information to. And these are all the different factors that we looked at. We had certain insights on these, and like I said, we think that these also apply to misinformation belief in misinformation on climate change. Another way to more look at the reasons of misinformation is to look at why people actually share misinformation. This is an article from Gordon Pennycook and colleagues, where they try to disentangle if people share misinformation because they are confused, because they really believe in what they are sharing. So this is the preference account in the middle, or because they are not really interested in whether they are sharing something true or false. It's more about other things, for example, on social media to get likes, for example, for sharing. And in the past, I did some surveys and different audiences to think what do you think is the most realistic or what is the most prevalent explanation of why people share misinformation. And it was always the case that people believe that it's the preference account. So people share misinformation because they don't care if it's false. But in fact, what this research shows is that this is actually not often the case for misinformation. So it's important that it's not about disinformation, but misinformation. And that actually often people just don't care a lot about the factuality of what they're sharing, but about other things, so the inattention account. So this explains a bit more the reasons why people share misinformation, and also, like I showed on the previous slide, how to identify certain groups that are very receptive to misinformation or that are in need of interventions to help them be resilient against misinformation. And this is now the account, so to fight misinformation. Eileen and you already talked about the different ways. So pre-bunking and debunking in particular, I think, are very well known. We often have a bit more wider understanding of what pre-bunking actually means. So also including games, for example, in which you actually are the person that in a playful environment needs to disinform others, because this actually tells you the strategies, makes you experience the strategies, and then actually there's a lot of evidence showing that this makes people more resilient to misinformation and better in spotting mis and disinformation. Then there's nudging, so creating decision environments in a certain way that is not prevalent to sharing disinformation and misinformation, and then of course the more classical debunking account. So I'm very quickly looking at, or going to present now a research that we did, where we basically wanted to find out if the work that our colleagues at the European Commission are doing, so to debunk and to pre-bunk, actually works for everyone and not just for people who are actually very favorable of the European Union, for example. But if it also works for people who are tend to be very distrustful of the European Union. And we did this experiments with more than 5,000 participants with representative samples from 4 different countries. And we included misinformation on COVID, also misinformation on climate change. And I'm going to look at very briefly on the data for all of these 4 countries, so not separated by country. And the main findings are actually that we see in this a bit abstract environment in which we test these interventions, that prebunks and debunks work. They reduce people's belief in the claim that these misinformation articles are putting forward. They are decreasing their intentions to share this misinformation with others. They are somewhat less successful at making people or inducing people to share this misinformation to warn others of it. But they are also very successful in reducing people's assessments of credibility of these articles. So they work. They have a bit harder time at changing behavior intentions for climate change compared to COVID-19. We don't really know why that might be the case. Maybe these climate change, because it's a bit older topic than COVID-19, maybe that is one part of the equation. We also find that it works if these prebunks and debunks come from the European Commission, which is very good news. Mostly the prebunks work irrespective of people's trust in the EU. So these prebunks work when they come from the EU, both for people who are distrustful of the European Union, both as well as for those who are more trusting of the European Union. There are some differences for climate change, misinformation, but these are really nuanced differences. So we would still overall say that they work irrespective of trust. And there is some cases where in debunks are more effective for people with high trust in the EU, not necessarily less effective if people are less trustful in the EU, except for certain specific outcome variables that we look at here. But overall, we interpret the findings so that the work that you are doing actually makes sense, which is good news, I think. And this is just to summarize. So the roots of misinformation, we think it's very important to not just to really understand why people share this information, to understand the psychology, the reasons, because this is the first step to having an effective approach to tackling disinformation and misinformation. To identify profiles does not really is not equal to understanding why people share misinformation, but it can still help to identify groups that are very receptive, that are not very resilient to misinformation. The European Commission is one key player in fighting mis and disinformation, and of course, overall behavior insights is a very important lens to analyze this whole challenge of disinformation. And this is basically the last slide. If you're interested, just some very concrete things to do. Also that you just mentioned, don't feed the trolls. So things, instead of engaging with someone, so to really think about, to take a step back, and then to take other actions basically in order to really engage in a constructive way with disinformation. That's it from my side. Thanks a lot. I think now it's going back to you.
Thank you, Hendrik. We now have time for our panel discussion. There are a couple of questions already on Slido, so let us dive in the first question here. Do you have a central hub to make resources to give facts of fighting chains against misinformation readily available for everybody? That might be a good question for our colleagues from Com and Klima.
Coming from the Director General of Communication, I can answer this one very quickly. The answer is right now, no. I can give you two resources that are very useful if you have young people in your lives or if you happen to be a teacher. If you go to the DG Com or the Directorate General for Communication, their Learning Corner. There are two things there. There is a guidelines for teachers on how to teach about disinformation, fighting against disinformation and general media literacy. They were developed by an expert group, really useful if you're developing want to integrate it into your teaching. There's also a toolkit for teachers, which is an off-the-shelf lesson plan for older teenagers like 15 to 18 that's currently being updated. Those are two resources that are very useful if you're working with young people. Honestly, they're also useful for me as an adult working with them. I've learned a lot from them. Another resource you could use is the European External Action Service have a website which I mentioned, EU versus Disinfo. They also have a lot of social media channels. It generally focuses on disinformation coming from Russia, so it's maybe not so climate focused, but there's some really good resources there. Maybe Jeremy can tell you a bit more about climate.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so on the European Climate Pact's website, actually, we have a list of resources that you can use to tackle disinformation. They're external resources that we've gathered there, so feel free to look at those. But also, simply, if in a pre-bunking approach, pretty much everything that we share on our social media channels is a resource against disinformation, in the sense that sharing it will help raise awareness of the facts. So that's something, if you're looking for something to share, feel free to do that.
Thank you. There's another question. Why no external panelists in the super interesting discussion? How much the Commission collaborates with NGOs and other key players on this topic? First of all, I can say this session was meant to give an overview of various activities within the European Commission. We thought about expanding also to NGOs, but given the time constraints, this was not possible. That might be a really good idea for the next time we organize such a panel. So the question really is, how much do we collaborate with NGOs then? Maybe Jeremy or yep.
Sure. Well, in terms of improving our approach to fighting disinformation, we think it's important to look at the resources that the work that other people are already doing and have already done. A number of NGOs and organisations out there working against climate disinformation who have done research which they're very happy to share with us and with everyone, in fact, that we can use to improve our knowledge of the climate disinformation landscape, and also of the tools that we can use to fight it. And I would certainly be in favour of, like you were saying, Jens, to have external participants in a future panel.
Yes. So that's a message to the anonymous question. We are going to follow up on this. There's another question. Could you list the 3 fundamental actions to fight misinformation? We've heard already from Hendrik about some concrete tips how to work with disinformation. Maybe Hendrik, if you have a comment.
I mean, I would actually look at it more from what I said on this one slide, that it's pre-bunking, nudging, and debunking. So debunking is the most common approach, but this always happens after the fact. Has some advantages because it allows you to really tailor your approach towards a specific article or towards a specific narrative that is out there. Whereas pre-bunking has the advantage that it's more generic, that it doesn't really need to target a specific narrative or a specific claim that is out there, but that can more talk about what are the common strategies, for example, that are used in misinformation articles. And these are, of course, the ones that you are working on, these strategies, so that basically explain people how can you spot misinformation, how can you approach misinformation. This makes them, I think, mostly resilient. And the thing in the middle, what happens basically, while people are exposed to misinformation, has to do with how we design the way in which we engage with misinformation. And there are ways, or there are designs of this engagement that makes it easier that we are exposed, or that we share misinformation, or that makes it a bit more difficult, that it's possible to share misinformation, but it makes it a bit more tedious for people. I think a very a known example would be that the case where on Twitter there was a little intervention before you share a tweet, that you were basically asked to at least open the link that you're going to share, so that it could be a bit more likely that you actually read and in case spot if there's something untrue in there. And I think these 3 aspects are integral and very fundamental aspects that need to be part of a whole, like of an encapsulating strategy against misinformation.
Thank you, Hendrik. There's another question about Russia, who seems to be a main disinformation leader. I can comment on this. So our ambition is really to look at all disinformation from really a global perspective. Having said that, we know that we are a bit biased. We lack certain sources in certain countries, for example, Latin America and in Africa. So we are going to look into this by employing also network analysis for identifying further sources. With that, I'm afraid our session comes to an end. And I would like to thank now again all speakers for the interesting presentations, and all the participants online for joining us today. And thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon.